let's say you're the technician managing a 4-story boiler. You spend 8 hours a day inside of the kill radius of a worst case boiler explosion. How would you like to be protected from a cyber attack that overpressurizes the boiler? Would you prefer a spring-loaded valve, or would you prefer a longer password on the computer controlling the furnace? The difference between the IT and the OT network is consequence.
Operational technology, or OT, share a lot of the same components as IT, but must be approached in a very different manner. On today's episode, I will be talking with Andrew Ginter, VP of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. We will be talking about the evolution of OT since 9/11, the similarities and differences to IT, the challenges and methods of improving critical infrastructure security with frameworks like cyber-informed engineering and consequence-oriented cyber-informed engineering. This is the Canadian Cybersecurity Podcast. I'm your host, Damon Bear. Today, I'm joined by Andrew Ginter, VP of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. Andrew, could you provide me a little bit of background of yourself and Waterfall?
Sure. Myself, I got started many years ago developing control system product, high-end product that's used in the world's largest pipelines, largest power grids at Hewlett Packard. I drifted into IT/OT middleware, connecting control systems to mostly SAP for business automation, for business efficiencies, thereby connecting a lot of IT and OT networks and contributing to the cybersecurity problems that now plague many industries. In a sense, I got religion. I wound up the chief technology officer at Industrial Defender, building the world's first industrial SIEM, and now I'm with Waterfall Security Solutions. Waterfall is a technology provider. We work with the world's most secure industrial sites. Our flagship is the unidirectional gateway, and I'll probably say more about that later in the show. But it was designed back in 2007 when advanced persistent threats were the big news, and it was designed to defeat them utterly. And that need has not gone away. So, we're still here. We're still protecting thousands of industrial sites worldwide.
Thank you for that. So there's been merging of what's deemed as IT versus OT as the criticality of IT systems becomes more apparent. How do you see these two different strategies or methods of managing separate networks merging together? And what are some of the challenges that are associated with that?
Yeah, it's a complicated space. I mean, in the early days, industrial cybersecurity, SCADA security, OT security, whatever you want to call it, really only got started after 9/11, after the physical assault on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. That was not a cyber attack, do not get me wrong. But in the aftermath, a lot of authorities said that was a failure of imagination. Where else have we failed? And they identified critical infrastructure cybersecurity and more broadly industrial cybersecurity. And before 9/11, in the late 90s, there were maybe a dozen academics, university professors involved in the space. And after, the World Trade Center attack, of course, there were hundreds and thousands of people are in the field now. And where did the field look to for inspiration? The first generation of advice, the first generation of standards were written largely by IT cybersecurity experts, because that's all the world had. And, in consultation with engineers. And basically they said, do security the IT way as much as you can. I know it's hard. Do security the IT way on your industrial networks. And that was the first generation. And, it was subtly wrong, but don't get me wrong. I'm grateful to those practitioners, the security experts from the IT world who came and bootstrapped this industry with that first generation of advice. But, today things are different. The latest thinking is, look, from the very beginning, we said, patching is hard to do on industrial networks because, The cure can be as bad as the disease. You shut the plant down if there's a blue screen. Encryption is just hard on these networks. I mean, where's the certificate authority? How do you verify the certificate? Do you go out to the internet for that? No, thank you. Even passwords are hard on these networks. You know, Science has demonstrated that every one of us becomes measurably stupid in an emergency. If I have to remember a password to trigger the safety shutdown to save my life, I'm sorry, I'm dead. So, for a long time, there's been advice saying OT is different. Try to do things the IT way, but we recognize it's hard. Try harder. Today, we recognize that OT networks are different, and all of these differences that have been documented forever are in a sense superficial. The fundamental difference is consequence. What's the worst that can happen on most business networks? You leak PII into the ecosystem, into the internet. You get hit with lawsuits from your customers. You suffer downtime. You've got to bring in really expensive consultants to clean out your system on an emergency basis. You pay some ransom. It's millions, tens of millions of dollars in damages. You can buy insurance for all of that. What's the worst that can happen on OT systems? It depends on the system, but often it's explosions and fires and environmental disasters and damaged turbines. A lot of this equipment costs hundreds of millions of dollars and takes months or years to produce and install. So you suffer enormous downtime. Here's the thing, we cannot restore human lives, nor environmental disasters, nor damaged equipment from backups. And even if we had a magic wand and we could wave the magic wand and patch everything, put antivirus everywhere, passwords everywhere, encrypt everything, even if we had that magic wand on the OT side, we would still have to manage the networks differently because of the consequence, because the consequence of compromise is unacceptable in many, but not all of these networks. And this is part of the confusion. A small shoe factory is an OT system, and it demands a very different kind of security management system than does a railway switching system, where the worst case consequences of compromise are a mass casualty event.
So what I've seen from a number of attacks that has happened over the past few years is that industrial systems that may not be directly attacked by a cyber attack are affected by attacks that happen on the IT side. If, for instance, there is an attack on management systems, on back-end systems, as a means of protecting possible lateral breach to the OT systems, organizations may do a shutdown of that environment preemptively until they get their house in order from the IT side. Do you believe that that is because the systems that are managing both are merging, or that the staff that are managing both are the same? Or what do you think the reasoning is behind that? Is it lack of visibility across the systems?
No, it's a little complicated. In our latest threat report, we identify 3 ways that ransomware attacks can impact physical operations. And, one is the obvious. The ransomware gets into the computers that are automating the physical process and, wreak havoc. And so you have to shut down. This was the Snake ransomware has that kind of code built into it. It hit, I think, Honda a number of times, goes right into the control system and wreaks havoc. That's the obvious. Less, so what you've mentioned is sort of less obvious. The catchphrase is abundance of caution. Ransomware gets into the IT network, and we look over at the OT network and say, we don't trust the security system on the OT network. And so we must shut this safety critical system down because we don't know what the ransomware is going to do, if it's going to leak into that system. It may not have leaked into there yet. We just don't know. And so we have to shut down. Abundance of caution. And the third way is a dependency. So, for example, the classic example was Maersk the container shipping company with NotPetya in 2017. It wasn't ransomware, but it behaved kind of, it pretended to be ransomware, the NotPetya. And Maersk shut down for 6 days because their IT network was crippled, not because the stuff got into their shipboard computers. Their ships still move, not because they were afraid of the ransomware getting into the shipboard computers. They were confident of their security in the ports and in the ships. The reason they shut down is because the system that tracked the EDI files that said where each of the thousands of containers on every ship went, those systems were crippled. And so you could take the crane still worked. You could lift the containers off the ships in the port. You could set them down on the truck, but you couldn't tell the truck where to go. And so shipping stopped. And this is an example of a dependency where physical operations depends on systems on the IT network. And so you can have the strongest OT security in the world if you depend on IT systems and those IT systems are crippled, your physical operations are crippled. So, this is something people have been looking at since, the latest security directives. These are the law. They're not, this is not advice. The latest directives out of the TSA for pipelines and for rail systems address these dependencies. But yeah, it's talking about the Canadian context, the number one type of attack that we see impairing physical operations is ransomware.
Some initiatives to change the way that security is approached for ICS systems has come to light over the past few years. And that's the adoption of cyber-informed engineering and consequence-oriented cyber-informed engineering. Can you talk a little bit about those and also the adoption that you've seen in the industry of this framework?
Sure. Where to begin? The one that came out first was CCE, consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. There's a textbook on it that Bachman and Friedman published out of Idaho National Labs. And, it's been around for a couple of years now. That is primarily about an OT risk assessment methodology. But there are 4 chapters in the book on mitigations. And it's those 4 chapters that people think of as the engineering, primarily the engineering end of it. The mitigations they talk about are, in a sense, unhackable. They're not really cybersecurity mitigations at all. They are engineering designs to address cyber risk. I mean, the engineering profession, where did the word come from? It was people who drove the trains, the locomotives. What was their number one priority? There was generally only one track across the continent because track was really expensive to lay. And so the number one priority was make sure that I'm the only train on the track. And so every time you go past, this is where the telegraph was invented. So they could reach out to an arm, grab a scrap of paper on the way by and figure out if they had to, pull to an emergency stop or keep going. Protecting safe operation, protecting their own lives, protecting public safety if there was passengers in the train. This was the number one, goal. And so the engineering profession from the very beginning has been tasked in part. I mean, there's many things engineers do, but in part with protecting public safety. And, consequence driven is saying, look, it's recognizing that the difference between the IT and the OT network is consequence. Even if we had the magic wand, the consequences are still different. You have to manage to the consequences. And so, the engineering profession for centuries has designed systems to address physical risk, has had very powerful tools at their disposal to address physical risk. The classic example in the modern day is, let's say you're the technician managing a 4-story boiler in a coal-fired power plant. There's a furnace under the boiler, produces a lot of steam. The steam goes into a turbine. You're calibrating the instrumentation. You're checking the ultrasound to see what the corrosion levels are. It's the boiler and 4 others like it in the plant are your job. You spend 8 hours a day inside of the kill radius of a worst case boiler explosion. If one of those boilers explodes, you never see your kids again. How would you like to be protected from a cyber attack that overpressurizes the boiler. Would you prefer a spring-loaded valve so that if the pressure in the boiler becomes too great, it forces a steel plate against the spring deforms, the steam escapes, and there's no explosion? Would you prefer a spring-loaded valve or 3? Because these things do wear out. Or would you prefer a longer password on the computer controlling the furnace? Most of us would like the valve, thank you, because it's unhackable. You know, this is an example. The safety systems like this, unhackable safeties, have been used to prevent explosions. Engineers design their systems to address risks like the risk of an earthquake, so that the boiler doesn't blow up during an earthquake and kill everybody nearby. The risk of a fire, the risk of explosion, the risk of toxic release. They're addressing all of these physical risks in their physical designs. And what people, what engineering, what the profession has started to do, but not systematically, has started to do is to apply these very powerful tools for managing physical risk, apply them to cyber risk as well, apply them to prevent physical consequences of cyber attacks. And so that is sort of there's examples of this in the 4 chapters of the book. And I say it's engineering, not cybersecurity, because if you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, where is an overpressure valve? Where's manual operations as a fallback if the control system's tripled so we can keep clean drinking water in the system? None of these engineering mitigations are in the NIST framework. None of these engineering mitigations are even in the industrial cybersecurity Bible, which is IEC 62443. They talk about cybersecurity mitigations, not physical designs. And so what CCE introduced was the concept of systematically applying physical designs in engineering to the task of addressing cyber risk as well as other kinds of risks. And the new cyber-informed engineering initiative is sort of taking that to the next step. Again, CCE was a lot about risk assessment, whereas cyber-informed engineering is sort of looking at the bigger picture. And basically, CIE is saying there's 2 sides to the coin. One side is the obvious that we've been talking about for 20 years, which is we need to teach more cybersecurity stuff to engineers. The other side of the coin doesn't even have a name. We're arguing over what the name should be on the calls that are trying to define this body of knowledge. That the other side of the coin is take safety engineering, automation engineering, protection engineering, network engineering, and apply them systematically to the task of addressing cyber risk as well as physical risk. That activity has no well understood name, but it is saying apply systematically the very powerful tools that the engineering profession has developed over the last 2 centuries to the task of cyber risk, in addition to cybersecurity. We need both sides of the coin. But to me, what's exciting about CIE, the new part about CIE, is the engineering mitigations.
In the cyber industry, there's a severe lack of personnel to address all of the open vacancies that there are in the industry, especially as threats keep on evolving and emerging. I imagine that's even more so in the case when we talk about managing industrial control systems, because you have to have that fundamental cybersecurity knowledge plus the additional industrial control system knowledge. How are organizations addressing this lack of resources or staff or capability in the industry?
It's complicated. I mean, there's brand new apprenticeship programs. There's universities involved with these. The organization that I remember being involved is EnergySec. So it's an apprenticeship program for cybersecurity in the power sector, the electric power sector. They're part of the mandate of the CIE initiative is to engage with, and this is a U.S. federally funded initiative. Part of the mandate is to engage with post-secondary institutions, help them put a framework together for curricula so that we can produce more trained people. But literally just 2 days ago, I was at a conference and, heard some folks from the Department of Energy speaking, saying, we're producing, people are coming out of these programs with OT cybersecurity credentials and they're not getting hired. What's going on here? And, part of the problem they identified was they can't find the job postings because there's no consistent language. You can't go to Monster and search for OT security. You won't find anything. People are calling the position something else. And there aren't a lot of entry-level positions. And a lot of the practitioners in the space enter the space with an engineering degree and 5 years experience as they take the next step to become involved in cybersecurity, or they come into the space with, an IT credential and 5 years experience on the IT side, and they learn about the OT side. It happens during their career, not at the beginning of the career. And so the situation seems very confused. I'm not an expert on this. I'm just giving you a couple of inputs that I've heard recently. It in my and there isn't one OT cybersecurity job. Okay, it's just like the IT security space. There's help desk, there's patching, there's policy, there's designing the systems, there's security analysts in the SOC that are looking at alarms all day long. There's incident response. There's the whole gamut, and some of them need a lot of knowledge, and some of them don't. And like I said, it just seems confused. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on that end of the space.
I definitely appreciate your insight as you have a lot of experience in seeing what challenges are seen in the industry. Now, on a different topic or subject, in terms of managing ICS infrastructures, how does that diverge in the way that IT infrastructure is managed in comparison of dashboards, management, real time, eyes on glass, having a knock or a SOC in place? Are those managed in the same sort of way? Do you have human operators 24/7 managing the environment? Or are those becoming more automated through leveraging AI and machine learning for ICS systems?
Generally speaking, it's a lot of the same technology. There are exceptions. There's stuff that's unique in the OT space. There's stuff in the IT space that just doesn't apply to the OT space. But most of the technology is the same. IT folk would come into an OT security environment and recognize the technology. In fact, they'd say it's a little old. We've been using this stuff for 5, 10 years, and you're just starting to use it. And that's by design. And it very much depends on where you go. So again, let me work the example of a small shoe factory a bit more. A small shoe factory has 30 machines in it, robotic machines. They all have moving parts. Friction is the enemy of moving parts. Wear is the symptom of friction. Things wear out. And when they wear out, you have to crawl into these machines, find the piece that's worn out and replace it. How do you protect? And what are the safety risks in that environment? The main safety risk is the risk to the technicians who are repairing the equipment. So when they have to crawl into a machine, they take a lever, they move it. The lever forces a pin into the gears. Okay, the gears can't move anymore. They put a lock on the lever. They put the key in their pocket, and now they can safely crawl into the machine. This is procedure. What's the worst case consequence of cyber compromise? Well, you might have to erase your computers, rebuild. You might have to call the emergency people in and pay through the nose to bring a guru in. You might lose a few shifts of production and have to schedule extra shifts. These are business consequences. You can buy insurance for this. And so the tools that you use to protect that network, because they're business consequences, the same as the kinds of business consequences you see on IT networks, it makes sense to use exactly the same tools and exactly the same approaches. There isn't a difference between small shoe factories and IT networks. You may as well manage the whole thing as an IT network. But again, at, rail switching systems, large power plants. I mean, fundamentally, all powerful tools are also weapons. The more powerful the tool, the more powerful the weapon. Many of the physical processes on the high end of the industrial base are very powerful tools. And so we have to manage them more aggressively. The engineering community calls it engineering change control. Before you apply a patch, you have to answer the question, how likely is this patch to kill anyone? And the answer is never zero. Okay, nothing is ever perfectly safe. And so the engineering community studies, the engineering team studies the patch. I mean, what does that mean? They don't have the source code to it. They test it for a long time in all the possible combinations they can think of. It's a very expensive process. So change control is one of the ways you manage. This is why things are slower in the OT space, because you just don't trust the new stuff for safety critical applications for a long time. You may never trust some of it. So that's sort of a general principle. But let me give you a more concrete example. One of the things that we're talking about in the CIE space, and I'm on these calls. One of the concepts that's emerging, especially in the I mentioned the TSA regulations for pipelines and rails. One of the new concepts in there, the TSA did not use the term, but I call it a consequence boundary. The TSA had a bunch of brand new, never before seen rules for the IT/OT interface at the boundary between a network with business consequences and a network with physical consequences. And I've seen this over and over again in other standards, older standards, and the newer ones coming out. That idea of a consequence boundary is something that almost doesn't exist in the IT space. I mean, there is some, military classified networks kind of have that concept, but it's a different application. There you're protecting information. Here we're protecting life and limb. At a consequence boundary, the TSA recent concrete example said, your goal, if the IT network is compromised, is to keep the pipeline running at necessary capacity. They didn't define necessary. I assume it meant at the capacity the society needs, necessary to the society. You will keep the pipeline running at necessary necessary capacity in spite of the IT network being crippled. To do this, you will design and implement a technology and procedure to physically separate these networks in an emergency. If IT goes down, you will exercise that option, separate the networks, and restart the pipeline. That means, remember, ransomware dependencies I talked about earlier on. That means there cannot be any dependencies on the IT network in physical operations. You must be able to run physical operations completely independently of the IT network. The second generation of regulation that came down and said, okay, I recognize that some of these dependencies are hard to get rid of. So, if you cannot get rid of a dependency, you must document it to the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. And you must explain, and they didn't say this, I'm paraphrasing, you must explain in one syllable words how you're going to keep the pipeline running in spite of this dependency during an emergency. They also said, shared trusts are a particularly dangerous kind of dependency. Get rid of them. And again, if you can't get rid of them, then document the residuals and explain in one syllable words, etc. So they're putting new rules in place at this consequence boundary because they're recognizing that these are two different kinds of networks. They need, you can buy insurance for your IT network going down and having to clean it out. You generally cannot buy insurance for the society, for the damage to society. There's no insurance company that will sell it to you due to a cyber attack taking the pipeline down. So at this consequence boundary, this is where we start seeing people deploying these sort of new approaches. They're deploying unidirectional gateways is sort of the most common example of what gets deployed at a consequence boundary. But we also see, there's a whole field of network engineering growing up that is talking about, there's a methodology from EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, on how to do industrial internet safely at a consequence boundary between a control network and the internet. It's an even bigger consequence boundary. There's a whole field of network engineering growing up that includes, old school air gaps and unidirectional gateways and the EPRI methodology and, the stuff that's coming out of the TSA as tools for managing that very important interface between networks that have different consequences, of worst case consequences of compromise.
What do you feel is the largest challenge that critical infrastructure has right now? And what are some methods of improving those challenges or mitigating the risks associated with those?
Biggest challenge, there's so many, but let me pick on a couple. Let's just say one is, I'm going to use the word awareness, but that's the wrong word. But let me use the word awareness. And the second one is that the space is still evolving. The understanding is still evolving. So let me start with awareness first. Again, on the IT side, the goal is protect the information. There's just, on the OT side, the goal is prevent disaster. Colloquially, it's stay left of boom, guys. And IT experts assume that you do the two the same way. A lot of the technology is the same, yes, but you apply it differently. So there's a lack of understanding on the IT side. There's a lack of understanding on the OT side. The engineering teams have sort of thrown security over the fence for a generation, almost a generation, and said, IT can handle it. And it's not happening. It's different. And the IT, as I said, the engineering profession has very powerful tools in this space. They're not being applied systematically, mostly through a lack of awareness. And part of the problem is that the threat is growing rapidly. It's getting steadily worse. I mean, let me back off on threat for a second. For 40 years, we've been deploying more and more automation in the industrial space. This is why we have cheap cell phones. This is why we have cheap drinking water. This is why we have cheap electricity. Automation makes everything cheaper, makes it more affordable for all of us. This is a good thing. But, in the modern world, all automation is computers and software. And so the more automation we deploy, the more targets we're deploying for industrial cybersecurity sabotage. And data in motion is the lifeblood of modern automation. And all cyber sabotage attacks are information. The only way a control system can change from a normal state to a sabotaged state is if attack information somehow enters the system. It might come in through a firewall. It might come in through a USB key. It might come in because a contractor's carried an infected laptop in. It might come in my head as I walk past physical security with a password and malicious intent. But for 40 years, we've been deploying more and more targets of cyber attacks, and we've been connecting those targets, deploying more and more, creating more and more opportunities for attack information to enter the system. Are either of these trends disappearing in the next 40 years? I don't think so. Okay, this problem's steadily been getting worse. You could ignore it 25 years ago. It wasn't a thing. Today, you can't ignore it anymore. The threat environment's changed. Ransomware has changed the equation. We're seeing physical outages more than doubling every year. We're on an exponential path. And business decision makers, boards of directors, engineering teams are still wrapping their heads around this, going, whoa, what happened? The world changed. Oh no, we have to do something different. What do we do differently? It's not like safety engineering that we've been doing it for 30, 40 years now. This is new stuff. And so awareness, not just among the engineering teams, but among the across the entire business, across the ecosystem, the regulators, awareness is a big thing. And the other one is that the techniques are still evolving. Nobody's ever before gathered engineering techniques into a body of knowledge that can be systematically applied to the task of dealing with cyber risk. And, even the ideas and the terminology, it was less than a decade ago, we looked around at the first generation of advice and said, thanks for that. But our goal is not to protect the information. Our goal is to prevent unacceptable physical consequences. Our first goal is safety. Our second goal is to keep the lights on, reliability. Our third goal is efficient operations. These are the goals for the industrial automation. These are the goals that a cybersecurity program has to support. The space is still evolving, and in part it's evolving comparatively slowly because, A, engineering change control, everything is slow in the space. It has to be. But B, there just aren't that many of us in the space. I'm sorry. If you put more brains on something, it moves faster. And, cybersecurity is a niche within IT. OT is a niche within IT. OT security is a niche within OT. We're talking a niche within a niche. And we're talking, what on the low end of sort of the consequence spectrum, it's the same as IT. It's only the high end of the consequence spectrum where we have to do things differently. So we're talking a niche within a niche within a niche. And it all gets confused because people say industrial cybersecurity and they mean a small shoe factory as well as a railway switching system. It's just taken time.
How important do you think government regulation is and international cooperation in securing ICS? And what role should these entities play in the fight against cyber threats?
Regulation is a controversial thing. Industry, by and large, hates it, though there are exceptions. Let me talk about an exception for one, and then I'll come back to regulation and cooperation. In most industries, people don't want regulation. They don't, because regulation introduces a new kind of risk. It introduces compliance risk, and it can be very expensive proving that you comply with things. There's a lot of paperwork, and you're going, the paperwork doesn't really buy us anything. It seems to be a pure expense. There's resistance to regulation. Though I was surprised recently when I learned that, big actors, big businesses in the shipping industry are interested in cybersecurity regulation. Why? Well, because they recognize that they have to do cybersecurity, but they can't because the shipping industry is extremely competitive. Okay. Profit margins are razor thin. Businesses go out of business because they miscalculated the profit margin. It went negative. And so, the big shipping companies, they cannot afford to do cybersecurity. They know they should be doing much more of it. They're worried about, the consequences, but they cannot afford to do any more cybersecurity than their competitors do. And so they're all saying, we really like regulation. So we all have to do what we know we should be doing anyway. So that's unusual. Most industries say, forget that, I don't want any regulation. Is it necessary? Well, it's confused. Again, the space is evolving rapidly. Maybe it's needed now. I don't know. Yeah. The problem with regulation is that, if you get it wrong, then everybody's focused their attention on stuff that's not addressing the risk. On the other hand, if you have nothing, a lot of entities do nothing. So I give the shipping industry as a data point. Another data point that, was sort of a surprise recently was the Colonial incident. Okay. Colonial's a super major. They're massive in the oil and gas industry. And when the pipeline went down because of a cyber attack, the government regulators looked at this, the government authorities looked at this and said, that should never have happened. We thought you guys had this under control. Who invented the very first industrial cybersecurity standard or guidance back in the day, 2003, 2004? The very first was, I think, 2006, because it takes a couple of years to put this together. And it was the American Petroleum Institute, 1164 standard. They had the first. 62443 was not the first. No, 2001-13, whatever the ISO standard that talks about industrial was not first. The petroleum industry was first. Government authorities thought that industry had this nailed and were shocked to discover that it is, and bang, 9 weeks later, there's regulations. It's a knee-jerk reaction. Are they the right regulations? Well, I said there was some interesting stuff in there. It is a very modern regulation, but it's a regulation. I would rather that people and businesses just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Like they figured out 30 years ago for safety. They said the threat is just too big. We're having too many explosions, and the whole, entire industries, plural, looked around and fixed the safety problem. And now safety is, so thoroughly ingrained. People ask the question, when's the right time to involve cybersecurity in your engineering designs? And I come back and say, when's the right time to involve safety in your engineering designs? From the very beginning. Thank you. That's what do you mean? What kind of a stupid question is that? When people ask the question, when is the time to involve cybersecurity? We need the same culture shift. It's only happening right now. That culture shift is happening right now. Ask me the question in 10, 15 years, and the answer will be, nobody cares about regulations. We're all doing cybersecurity and it's designed in from the very beginning because you have to. Right now, maybe regulations serve a transitional role, but again, the regulation generally says the minimum everyone has to do. And has a hard time distinguishing between small sites and much more consequential sites. The regulation says you have to do this stuff and you have to prove that you do this stuff. Proving it is expensive. And the stuff that they're asking us to do, is it the right stuff? There's 3 people at the regulator who put this together. Are they the smartest people in the world? There's issues with regulation, but it might be that for now we need some of it. It's heavily debated in the industry.
All right, well, thank you very much for that, Andrew. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot in the process. Before we go, Is there anything that you'd want to leave with our listeners, perhaps on more information, resources, or how to reach yourself or Waterfall online?
Sure, sure. Where to begin? I would, so thank you for having me on your podcast. I would mention to listeners that I'm also a podcast host on the Waterfall Industrial Security podcast. You can go to your favorite podcasting app and search for Industrial Security and find us. It's not a podcast about Waterfall. Waterfall sponsors it as a public service. It's a podcast about industrial security. Like you, we have a different guest on every episode, showing us, a different piece of the elephant. And, I talked about the ransomware threat, the threat environment. If you're interested in the threat report, it's, I think, 20 pages long and half of it's appendix. So, it's an easy read. It's on the Waterfall website, waterfall-security.com. And then look under the resources menu and white papers and ebooks, you'll find it there. And, I would encourage you, if you're interested in the space, Waterfall puts out a lot of stuff. I talk on events like this. I do webinars. I'm writing a new book that's coming out in mid-October. If you get on the Waterfall mailing list, we will inflict upon you a newsletter every typically 2 to 3 weeks. And it'll have all the new reports, it'll have the announcement of the book when it's available. So, and to do that, the easy way is go to the podcast, under waterfall-security.com, resources, podcasts, and sign up for the podcast notifications. The newsletter is the podcast notification. You'll get, a mention of each new podcast in the newsletter as they come out every 2 weeks. So maybe, that's what springs to mind.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And, I wish you the best. This is a field that as I said, I don't think is going to go away anytime soon. The advice I give to young people is, the economy goes up and down. It's hard to find jobs in OT security, but the security problem in the next 40 years is going to get worse before it gets any better. So, there's opportunities here. There's an opportunity for, people to build a career. There's opportunity for people to contribute in very important ways to a very important field.
I'm from the Great White North, right? Like up above the States.
Yeah.
The big landmass that the rest of the world hates.
Yeah.
We're like above that. North, I guess. The big patch of trees where everybody's bored to death. We're just chilling up here, sipping syrup, playing hockey. Before we learn to walk, we can cross-check properly. Just rocking plaid jackets. Chainsaws, we operate them. Hey, right, we do, bud. We cut our weight in firewood. Every 20 minutes or so. Smoke break. And if the Leafs make the playoffs, I'll jump in the lake. Buddy comes over to my place the other night and he's like, "You want to go out for a rip?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, bud. Just still for a rip, are you, bud? Just still for a rip. Just still for a rip, are you, bud? Just still for a rip. Just still for a rip, are you, bud? Just still for a rip. Just still for a rip, are you, bud? Just still for a rip.